Almost every week, another young life is snuffed out. Another family is decimated by sudden cardiac death.
The day he was born was the happiest day in my life, and the day he died was the saddest.
For years, ministers have resisted pleas to take this problem seriously.
They will not listen. They just shut the door.
Now, with legal aid, families are taking them on. This is the story of a heart disease that claims at least one young life in Britain every week. It is the story of the families left devastated by needless tragedy, and of how even doctors remain ignorant of the dangers. Above all, it's the story of a government's reluctance to take the simple measures which could make the difference.
You don't expect to bury your own children. You always expect them to bury you. It's as simple as that. He was such a loving kid. He was the firstborn. And to lose somebody like that, a child of any description, it is just indescribable.
Granville Staff's son David was just 17 when he died suddenly during a 10-kilometre run. Apparently fit and healthy, David was the victim of a heart complaint called Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy, or HCM, the principal killer of young people in so-called sudden death syndrome.
David and myself used to go running through the woods. He was such an outdoor character. We've actually scattered some of his ashes around the reservoir where we actually ran. And I try and go there at least twice a week. The day he was born was the happiest day in my life, and the day he died was the saddest. It's as simple as that.
If you lose a parent or a grandparent, it's tragic, but you're dealing with someone who's lived at least some part of his life, has reached adulthood, and when you lose a child, you basically, most parents in many ways lose their reason for going on. Certainly the death of a child often results in the death of a family.
She had twins.
David Whittaker and his mother have come to see Bill McKenna, the leading authority on HCM in this country.
Had he ever had problems before?
HCM is the #1 cause of cardiac death in young people, and much of McKenna's time is spent treating families like the Whittakers with a history of the disease. David Whittaker lost his only brother to the condition, so he may be at risk too.
Let me take your blood pressure again.
Some simple tests will tell David what his family needs to know. HCM has been quietly claiming young lives for years. It's only when there's a high-profile death that it moves out of the shadows and into our newspapers.
5 days ago, Daniel Yorath was an apparently fit and healthy teenager with his whole life to look forward to.
HCM is the disease that killed Terry Yorath's son, Daniel.
His parents, former Leeds football star Terry Yorath and his wife Christine, led over 500 mourners for the Catholic Mass.
It's an inherited abnormality of the heart muscle, where the muscle is typically thickened, and being thickened, it is very aggressive in its contraction. If you watch it beat, it goes very aggressively, and then it's very stiff filling. It's stiff, inefficient muscle, and then stiff to fill, to get it out, stiff to fill.
The unusual structure of the muscle cells interferes with the electrical activity of the heart. The result can be cardiac arrest.
I see approximately a family a week who've lost a young child. That's, say, 50 a year. Usually, but not just hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Am I seeing the tip of the iceberg, or am I seeing the majority? Probably neither. I'm probably seeing, a third to a fifth, or maybe even less. So, you're looking at somewhere between maybe 150 and 500 young sudden deaths. And the presumption would be that most of these are preventable.
But for years, the government has ignored the complaint and resisted the pleas of Professor McKenna and the families of victims for HCM to be taken seriously. According to the government, you can't diagnose it easily, and even if you could, there's little that can be done. Officially, it is claimed only 1 child in every 5,000 is affected, too few to be considered important. But recent research work carried out in the United States could change the picture dramatically. This exhaustive study shows that HCM is at least 10 times more common than the government statistics admit. HCM was found to be present in 2 in every 1,000 people examined. To put that in perspective, HCM is 5 times more common than cystic fibrosis. It's 8 times more common than muscular dystrophy. And it's 20 times more common than sickle cell anemia, all of which makes it hard to ignore HCM on the grounds that it's rare.
I think that would have been a fair response from a government 15 years ago based on the available information. Certainly now it's not a fair response. And there's no question, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is not rare.
But Shona Hill doesn't need a study to tell her how common HCM is. She just needs to look at her family tree. Doctors found Shona had HCM when she had a baby. But it was only later that she began to piece things together.
I started investigating all the people that had died suddenly, right back to my grandfather's brothers. We were finding out that people had died suddenly, but it was never recorded as cardiomyopathy. First instance I ever knew about would be my great-uncle Adam, who died in the 1920s, age 30. This is what I've been told. He was riding his bike one day and suddenly dropped down dead. They put it down to rheumatic fever. My dad's brother, my Uncle Scott, he died in 1963, running upstairs to get his baby a nappy, and his wife found him collapsed over the cot. He had 2 children. Anne, who was 14, she was out doing cross country one day. She died suddenly. Her brother John, who died in 1984, as far as I know, he wasn't doing anything, active. He was watching television and he just suddenly died.
But Shona's interest in HCM was more than just historical. If it was in her family tree, the chances were that other living relatives would be affected. She set out to alert them.
I wrote to Australia, where half the family had emigrated to in the 40s. We received letters back from them, And it was the same story. There was people being diagnosed as having cardiomyopathy or heart disease. But, you know, we didn't have that much information either, so it was hard. And to try and make people realise, you know, they were fit and healthy, they didn't think they were going to have heart disease.
Shona had already been down to see Professor McKenna in London, where her 2 children were tested and cleared.
We thought, you know, once we had done that, that the rest of the family would follow. But unfortunately, 2 weeks after we came back from London, Ian died suddenly. We knew right away Ian had died of cardiomyopathy.
Ian Bell was Shona's 15-year-old nephew, and he just signed as a professional footballer with Hartlepool.
To look at Ian, you'd never have thought he had heart disease, because he was healthy. He was a handsome-looking young man, had a great future ahead of him as a professional footballer, and he died suddenly one day in the gym.
The government would agree that all such stories are desperately sad. But what could have been done? The government has suggested an organised response to HCM is ruled out by the insensitivity of current screening processes. But had Ian Bell been born here, there's a good chance he would still be alive. This is Padua in northern Italy, home of the oldest medical school in the world.
In Italy, there's a systematic screening program. I think the evidence is highly suggestive that the screening program has prevented sudden death.
This is the man who in the early 80s became the driving force behind a coordinated campaign against sudden cardiac death in his region of northern Italy.
There are so many people, so many young people, millions doing sport activity, that this activity has to be regulated in some sort in order to ensure health during sport activity. So there are a series of examinations that by law every year a young competitive sportsman should undergo to be declared available to cope with sport activity.
Last year, the Padua Centre ran heart checks on 10,000 youngsters. The doctors do a simple electrocardiogram or ECG test to check for abnormalities, with further tests if needed. Doctors here would laugh at any claim that screening is not sensitive enough and that HCM is difficult to diagnose.
This is the most easy, the most cheap screening to detect or rule out the presence of cardiac abnormalities and to diagnose the presence of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, in which the cardiac deformation are such that even a student of medicine, even a young doctor is able to make the diagnosis.
Because of screening, the number of young HCM deaths in Padua has been dramatically reduced.
I think that we should be very proud to have realized the drop of sudden death by hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in the athlete group.
Although similar facilities are in place in this country, they are rarely used to identify cases of HCM, and British children continue to die at a rate of at least 1 a week. In the days after his son's death, Granville staff's frustration at the official inertia was matched only by his shock at the medical ignorance he encountered. HCM is usually an inherited condition. Sufferers have a 1 in 2 chance of passing the disease on to their children. David has a younger brother, Neil.
Obviously our prime concern then was, has Neil got the condition, could Neil have the condition, and we were led to believe that the condition was not hereditary. I actually spoke to the coroner twice and the home office pathologist once, and all along we were led to believe the condition was not hereditary.
If David had HCM, his brother Neil might have it too. It wasn't until 4 months later that Granville discovered the truth.
What was your reaction when you found out that this disease was in fact an inherited disease?
Anger. The fact that the medical profession hadn't advised us to be screened, hadn't pointed in the right direction to be screened, and just let us live the 4.5 months in sheer ignorance.
Neil was tested at once. Happily, the results were negative. But if he'd had HCM, the family's 4 months of ignorance could have proved fatal. One of the problems is the way that coroners operate.
When any death happens where there's no obvious cause, the coroner will become involved. His mandate is to make sure that there has not been foul play. In other words, there's not a knife in the back or toxic levels of a drug that's been administered. And once he's done that, he can say that the death was due to natural causes. Once he's done that, he's actually completed his mandate.
This inevitably means HCM deaths are submerged in the official statistics. It also means families of victims may not get screened. McKenna believes less than half those at risk currently get checked. Professor Thienne at Padua's School of Pathology realized long ago that it didn't have to be this way. 15 years ago, he arranged to be sent the heart of every young person who died suddenly in the region. The information gathered in the resulting examination was put to good use.
When you identify a case of sudden death with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, immediately you have to alarm both the family doctor and the familial relatives, especially the parents or brothers or even children, offspring, in order to submit them to all the clinical investigation and establish whether or not they are affected.
In the UK, Professor McKenna has pressed for a similar scheme. When a young person dies suddenly, he wants the heart sent to an expert pathologist. Until that happens, he says, many of these deaths will continue to be recorded as natural.
Need to take your blood pressure again. Let me have your arm.
With the hit-and-miss system that operates in this country, David Whittaker was lucky. His doctors spotted HCM in the family, and now he's in the hands of Professor McKenna's team.
Good.
But my sister hasn't, and her 3 children.
But the government has maintained a more organised programme of screening isn't feasible because there are no proven remedies. But McKenna argues there are plenty of effective treatments available to him.
And the simplest and best treatment is a drug, amiodarone, and it's something you take once a day.
So how long will I have to take this drug for then now?
Well, that's a good question. It's something certainly indefinitely, but we would hope that as time goes on that there will be better forms of treatment. David in particular had most of the risk factors for sudden death, and the question was whether or not to do further tests to identify risk. The decision was made that he doesn't actually need further tests. He is obviously at risk and we should start him on treatment. In this instance, the decision was made to use a drug which has been shown to be effective in patients like David. There's an awful lot that can be done to, 1, identify the high-risk patient, and 2, to treat him. The appropriate treatment, be it a drug, an operation, a pacemaker, will be effective if selected appropriately for the right patient. So I think the attitude that nothing can be done is inappropriately nihilistic and is wrong.
We wanted to ask the government about HCM, but nobody could be made available. Mick Powell reckons he knows all about government inertia. His campaign is driven by the belief that others shouldn't suffer like him.
It knocks you, it's unbelievable, it's a complete hole in your life has gone. There's a part of your life is missing. After the death of anybody, but particularly the death of a child, it is very, very hard.
Mick Powell wants the government to listen, and now, fired up by his own terrible loss, he's got legal aid to pursue a judicial review of current policy.
Emma was full of life. Her main interest in life was animals. She wanted to be a veterinary surgeon. To look at her, you wouldn't think there was anything wrong with her. Outwardly, she was absolutely full of life. Energy bursting out of her ears. She collapsed in the middle of a field and never regained consciousness, and she was pronounced dead at the scene.
He was told the chances of it happening again were remote, but 8 years later it did to his son Paul.
Well, he went to school that morning perfectly normal, and it was round about 11 o'clock, I think, he collapsed in the school playground. It was exactly the same thing. He was dead when he hit the floor, and he never regained consciousness again. The grief is unbelievable, and though I can carry it reasonably well, it's bad enough to have one child buried, but when Paul died, to have that grave open the second time and have a second child put in the same grave, you know, it's beyond belief.
Central to Mick Powell's case is an editorial on screening for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, published in the British Medical Journal in 1993. It is this article that the government quotes when explaining to bereft families that there's little that can be done. In it, the author, Andrew Coates, says that you can't screen the whole population, a position not even Bill McKenna would dispute. But the government, drawing on Coates' editorial, has seemed to reject all screening, even targeted screening. In doing so, the government throws the baby out with the bathwater, according to Coates.
I think the government may have misinterpreted our position on screening in that they used it as an excuse not to look at research into screening procedures or screening close family relatives where there would be a value in that. I think if it's just used in global terms, it's implying there's no value for screening, and that's a mistake. Screening's not feasible for the whole population. Screening for family members and high-risk people is probably not only feasible, but clearly indicated.
The fact is, they will not listen. They just shut the door. And I mean, I've had to kick doors down, walls down, to get through to these people. And I shall continue doing so until I get success.
One has the impression from discussions within the ministry or with the ministry people that they're certainly aware there's a lot more that can be done. Officially, that hasn't been reflected, however, in any action in any major way.
This present government are trying to get people off the backsides and taking more exercise, asking children to take part in more competitive games, yet this condition kills far too many youngsters, and the government are trying to encourage this. And I just cannot understand the lack of responsibility. I honestly can't.